transportation, copper for wires, cobalt for alloys, tungsten, tin, uranium, and in the age of globalization, the Congo has coltan, that conductor that's used to power our cell phones, our laptops, our pagers, etc. So at every turn, the underdevelopment of the Congo has played a critical role in the development of the West. And what we're currently witnessing in the Congo is a humanitarian disaster of epic proportions. A 15-year-old civil war, which actually could be dated back to so-called independence back in 1960, and even the notion of the civil war does violence to what's really going on. This is truly an international affair. But regardless, this 15-year-old civil war has resulted in millions dead, hundreds of thousands of displaced refugees, hundreds of thousands of orphans, children being impressed as slaves, as child soldiers, and an epidemic of mass rape and brutal sexual violence being used as an instrument of terror against civilian populations. And the major zones of this conflict are precisely those mineral-rich areas of the eastern and northern provinces of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, excuse me, where the government troops, the rebel leaders, and these foreign fighters are all vying for control over the natural resources and raw materials for export to the industrialized nations. So Congo is merely one of the most graphic examples of the many layers of structural violence in the global economy. Which brings me to my fourth point. I'd like to bring it to domestic style. H. Rap Brown once said, "Violence is American as apple pie." And given this nation's historical foundations and the continued economic underpinnings, this statement contains more than a grain of truth. The United States is the greatest purveyor of violence on the globe. Weapons and warfare are two of the few things that the post-industrial United States actually still manufactures. And given the central economic importance of the military-industrial complex to our economy, as the financial markets constrict, as non-renewable resources further deplete, as global warming and ecological devastation generate deeper poverty, pushing desperate people into ever more desperate situations, as these contradictions become more and more acute, war and the means of destructions will no doubt become exports of even greater importance to the United States in these times of global financial uncertainty and geopolitical instability. The United States makes up 5% of the world's population, but consumes upwards of 25% of the planet's resources. This global inequality is also reflected at the national level. The top 1% of U.S. income earners own almost 40% of all private wealth, an income gap that has been growing steadily since the 1990s. Millions of homes are currently being foreclosed on, disproportionately affecting poor people of color, and billions of dollars are being poured into investment banks, disproportionately affecting white men. Working class people, immigrants, and people of color, particularly women, are bearing the brunt of this savage inequality. The structural violence of our economic system is reflected in the physical and psychic violence in our society. Our society is saturated in violence. From the spectacular violence of 2 wars costing hundreds of thousands of lives, billions and billions of dollars, and wreaking untold destruction, to the everyday violence of hate speech, racist and sexist verbal assault. From the massive carceral violence of the prison industrial complex to the quotidian violence of an innocent cartoon in the New York City newspaper. Our society is saturated in violence. A society with a multi-billion-dollar pornography industry in which rape, sexual assault, and domestic violence are everyday epidemics. Everyday occurrences that for the most part pass unnoticed unless they are sufficiently brutal or sensational to sell newspapers or boost ratings, or if it should happen to a well-liked pop star. This is the everyday violence that we tend to ignore. As our capitalist system began trafficking in human beings, so it ends. Legal and illegal immigration, refugees and forced migrations, poor people and people of color the world over are moving and being moved in response to global economic flows, environmental catastrophe, local hardships, and the structural violence of 21st century capitalism. From sweatshops to sex work, from fields to factories, from the service sector to the underemployment line. Women of color, and especially third world women of color, are disproportionately locked at the bottom of the socioeconomic hierarchy, occupying the lowest rungs of our society and bearing the brunt of the violence of our New World disorder.